Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, and we're continuing our series on the history of the New Deal and the undoing of the New Deal. And now joining us again is Peter Kuznick. Peter joins us from Washington. He's a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. He's also the co-writer with Oliver Stone of the Untold History of the United States. Thanks for joining us again, Peter.
Hi, Paul. How are you doing?
So we're picking up the tale, sort of after Truman comes Eisenhower. There's been an ongoing debate in the United States, and it's still not over, about the relationship of military spending and social programs. And where is the money going to come from to pay for the social safety net, to pay for the New Deal? The right-wing conservatives, they have always, this has been going on for a long time, although of course we're seeing a renewed bout of it now. And essentially it's lower taxes, lots of military spending, and take it out of social programs. This debate ain't new. So talk about how this reflects itself towards the end of Truman and the Eisenhower years.
One of the things we need to mention to start off with is NSC 68. NSC 68 was proposed in 1950. It was drafted largely by Paul Nitze, who was very, very hawkish. And NSC 68 was a new approach to defense spending. It called basically for quadrupling America's defense spending. The idea was that now American policy had to be based on not what the Soviet Union was likely to do, but what the Soviet Union was capable of doing in a worst-case scenario. It looked like it was dead on arrival when it was first introduced in 1950. However, the Korean War intervened. And once the Korean War started on a large scale, then they were able to push NSC 68 through. So what we see is after World War II, the demobilization, the decrease in defense spending, Truman tries to ramp it up again in 1946, 1947, and then we've got a slow but steady increase in defense spending up to 1950. Then we see a quadrupling in defense spending. So the military budget has gotten tremendously bloated between 1950, when NSC 68 was introduced, and 1953, when the Korean War finally comes to a halt.
We've talked about, to a large extent, was a response to the deep crisis of unemployment, deep crisis of global capitalism. But coming out after the Second World War, most of the American elites don't think there needs to be such an appeasement with American workers. And a lot of the elites want to undo some of those reforms. You have this big increase in military spendings. You have the Cold War, which helps justify all this. You have McCarthyism, and as we talked about earlier, even before McCarthy starts holding his hearings, there's congressional hearings of Un-American Activities Committee, purging the unions, purging schools, purging government, purging Hollywood of progressives and left-wingers. So it's all in this environment that the 1950s evolves. So what happens to the New Deal type reforms as Eisenhower comes to power in all of this?
Well, Eisenhower is a particularly interesting figure. He's a military man, but he's a military man in a new era, in the nuclear era. I think it was 3 days before Eisenhower was elected in November of 1952, the United States tested its first hydrogen bomb. It was over the island of Aluga Lab. There was a mushroom cloud, something like 60 miles long, and the island of Aluga Lab disappeared into the sea. It was gone. So that was our first hydrogen bomb test. And Eisenhower's vision was that the greatest threat to the United States economically and security-wise was an unbalanced budget. He thought we could sink ourselves by too much spending. So Eisenhower's strategy was to actually cut defense spending. Eisenhower wanted to effectively minimize the Army and go with the Air Force and our nuclear programs. And the reason why Eisenhower was so hawkish when it came to nuclear weapons was because they were so much less expensive, they believed, than conventional defense spending. So what we see with Eisenhower is when Eisenhower takes office, the United States has a little bit more than 1,000 nuclear weapons. When Eisenhower leaves office, the United States has more than 22,000 nuclear weapons. When Eisenhower's budget cycle is finished, the United States has almost 30,000 nuclear weapons. So that was the bargain that Eisenhower made with the devil, that the United States would be able to cut defense spending, cut budgets overall in the 1950s, but do so by this massive increase in nuclear weapons. So the vision that a lot of the scientists had and Henry Wallace had in 1945, this fear, this apocalypse that we were creating potentially, came to fruition under Eisenhower. So we've got the capability, this overkill capacity by the end of the Eisenhower administration, to not only eliminate ourselves, but to eliminate everybody on the planet several times over.
Eisenhower often gets quoted as this famous quote of Eisenhower about beware of the military-industrial complex. But when you read that, it's not that he doesn't think there needs to be a military-industrial complex. He does. He just thinks beware of how the political effect of having such a massive part of the economy devoted to arms manufacturing. But he's not really for minimizing it. He's just for being beware of it.
He's afraid that it was growing out of control. And he had good reason to fear that because he had created the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower, almost as much as anybody, perhaps more than anybody else, can be considered the father of the military-industrial complex. So Eisenhower, in the worst sense of the military-industrial complex, in the sense that we're creating the seeds of our own annihilation through this process. So it wasn't only the extent to which they subverted normal democracy in America, and we've seen the effects of the arms lobby. In fact, in the original draft of the speech that Malcolm Moos from Johns Hopkins had written of the military-industrial complex speech, along with Williams, they talk about the merchants of death. They go back to the 1930s term that was so popular to talk about the arms merchants from World War I, and they bring that up in the first draft. So Eisenhower said he wanted to go with that kind of vision about a military establishment that was out of control, in bed with industry, threatening us all. But his final version was not actually as strong as the initial versions that were drafted for that speech.
Now, what happens in terms of the New Deal legislation during Eisenhower?
Well, I think that Adlai Stevenson probably got it correct. Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic candidate who ran against Eisenhower in 1952. Eisenhower said, the New Dealers have all left Washington and been replaced by the car dealers. And that was the Eisenhower administration. It was a cabinet of millionaires. Now that's not so shocking. Now we've got a cabinet of billionaires. But the idea in the 1950s that you would have a cabinet of millionaires seemed obscene to many people. And so Eisenhower told them, be careful. Let's not say anything that's going to offend public sensitivities when it comes to how wealthy this cabinet is. Unfortunately, they didn't all get the message. There were two Charles E. Wilsons at the time. There was Engine Charlie, the head of GM, and then there was Electric Charlie, the head of GE. Well, Engine Charlie became the defense secretary in the 1950s. And he made some comments talking about the unemployed as kennel-fed dogs, and which was the opposite message that Eisenhower was trying to send. And so the word started to spread at the time that Wilson, when he was head of GM, developed the automatic transmission so he'd always have one foot free to put in his mouth. But this was the kind of cabinet that they had. It was a very wealthy cabinet, and the administration policies, Eisenhower was fortunate in a sense that the 1950s were a time of relative prosperity in the United States, in which everybody seemed to be, standards of living seemed to be improving across the board. Of course, they went up faster for some people than they did for others, but there was still a time, despite the fact that there was a major recession in 57, that there were periodic declines in the 1950s, but it was a time of relative stability. You have to remember the 50s was the time when we have suburbanization, when we have a rapidly growing middle class, when you've got people buying cars, buying automobiles, buying their own homes, the GI Bill made a lot of this possible. Now, the people who benefited the most from the GI Bill were mostly whites, of course, but they moved out to the suburbs, and so you've got these Levittown kind of communities developing. Many of them had covenants that said that they weren't even allowed to let blacks move in, other minorities move in. This was a time when the Donald Trump seniors, the Fred Trumps, are having their restrictive covenants in their housing, in the apartments that they're building, or they're refusing to rent to African Americans. So you've got this white suburbanization process developing in the 1950s at a time, again, of relative prosperity. And so,
can I just add? Can I add when you? I think it's important to say relative prosperity because it was the sort of upper sections of the working class, the unionized sections in places like Otto, that were doing very well. The poverty rate was actually very high.
And that's why there's going to be a war on poverty in the 1960s, because poverty had not been eliminated, certainly. But we see the rise of the gun belt in the 1950s, rise of places like Los Angeles, the Southwest, Atlanta, areas that are going to be profiting from the vast defense spending and the aerospace industry. You got to remember the aerospace is really going to get a huge boost in the 1950s, especially in the aftermath of Sputnik. And so we're going to see a shift in the economy once the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was launched on October 4th, 1957. And Sputnik, Eisenhower downplays the effects of that. He says, oh, I'm not impressed. They've launched one small ball into space. He says, not a big deal. In fact, he went out and played, I think it was 5 rounds of golf that week to show that he wasn't impressed with Sputnik. However, the next month, November 1st, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2. Now, this is serious. Not only did they send the dog into space, but Sputnik 2 weighs 6 tons. That creates a tremendous crisis in American society, because the Soviets had already tested an intercontinental ballistic missile prior to launching Sputnik 1, and the Americans started to panic. We set up a committee, the Gaither Committee, which issues a very, very frightening report. The Washington Post has a big front page article saying that the United States is now facing the gravest crisis in its history. This is an existential crisis for the United States. And so the view in the United States was that not only the United States, actually around the world, was that the Soviets were ahead of the United States in scientific, technological, and defense capabilities. Of course, it wasn't true. Alan Dulles later commented, he said, head of the CIA, or I think it was Alan Dulles, might have been John Foster Dulles, who said, I wasn't concerned. I could see every blade of grass in the Soviet Union. I knew exactly what they had, and I knew how far ahead we were. Eisenhower had that same sense of certainty and security because we were having our U-2 flights, and we were actually getting very, very good intelligence, and we knew the Soviets were not ahead. The Soviets were actually far behind the United States. However, but we still increased defense spending. Eisenhower actually tried to tamp down the fears and tamp down the increase in defense spending, again, fearing we would bankrupt ourselves. But there is a lot of pressure then to reform America's education system. The question was, while we're so concerned with how plush the carpet is going to be and with the fins on our cars, while the Soviets are spending money on education, on science and technology, and they've outflanked the United States, and they're far ahead of us. And so that becomes a crucial issue in American society. The Democrats realize they've got an issue that can put them back in the White House. They can use this to run against the Republicans in 1960. Lyndon Johnson's aides give him a memo that Johnson later trumpets that says this is going to put the Democrats not only in control, of both houses, but also in control of the White House again. And Kennedy is one of the ones, John Kennedy is one of the ones who runs based upon what was called then the missile gap. The idea that the Soviets have got a vast abundance, a vast superiority in missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles over the United States. And so Kennedy and others do a lot of fear-mongering about that, attack the Eisenhower administration for being weak on defense, for allowing the Soviets to get ahead of us, and then in 1959, allowing the Cuban Revolution, communist revolution, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This all comes together and becomes crucial in the 1960 election when Kennedy defeats Nixon very, very narrowly, despite all that Kennedy had going for him.
Now, I think it's important to kind of elaborate that sections of the American working class really benefited from all of this militarization. They benefited from the post-war expansion. You know, Europe had been laid waste, and so had the Soviet Union. American capital and goods were expanding all over the world. American hegemony was being asserted. And a section of the American working class was doing very well in riding this gravy train. But a large section was not, and it wasn't just all black. Unorganized white workers were not doing anywhere near as unionized white workers were. And a real division was developing, and this starts to build up as we head into the 60s. But when we get to Kennedy, we actually see another leap in militarization.
Well, one of the things that we saw in the 50s, as we discussed, the labor movement takes a big hit when the communists are forced out of the unions. But in the mid-50s, you have a pretty conservative leadership under Meany still, but you've got the merger of the AFL and the CIO in mid-decade, which is going to give the labor movement a little more strength. You've got the Reuther wing of the labor movement, the industrial unions that really had been making progress in the 40s and 50s. I think, and don't quote me on this for sure, but I think the percentage of American workers who are in unions peaks around 1948, but is still strong in the 1950s. And it's not till the 1950s that we begin to see a relative decline in the industrial sector compared to service and white-collar kinds of jobs. But American industry is still thriving and going strong in the 1950s. And so based upon that, you've got more and more workers being brought into the middle class, or at least into having what we define then as middle-class standards of living, suburban lifestyles, owning their own homes. And so you've got a big expanding middle class in the 1950s. But as you're saying, many, many, many workers are going to be left behind. And we're going to see the relative decline in the percentage of workers who are unionized beginning in the 1950s, really.
And with Kennedy, as I said and you said, I think it's actually the largest increase in military spending. Was it in U.S. history outside of a war? Am I right in that?
I'm not sure if you're right in terms of the largest increase, but we do see a sharp increase in military spending. I like to divide the Kennedy presidency into two periods. From Kennedy's election until the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62, Kennedy is a real defense hawk. Kennedy is a Cold War liberal from '60 to '62. But then Kennedy sees the light in '62, and the last year of Kennedy's presidency, he's trying to roll back the hawkish Cold War policies that defined his earliest presidency. And so he gets off on a very bad foot with the Bay of Pigs. It was a fiasco. It was Trump-esque in its absurdity. And so Kennedy...
For people that get it really fast, for people that don't know what the Bay of Pigs was.
Kennedy inherited a plan from the Eisenhower-Nixon administration to overthrow the Castro government in Cuba. And the CIA trained a large force of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba in 1961, with the understanding, the promise that They would be greeted as liberators when they arrived, and the Cuban people would rise up and overthrow the Castro administration. Kennedy had his doubts from the beginning. He warned people that he was not going to send in American forces back up this Cuban exile force if they were in trouble. The assumption in the intelligence community in the Pentagon was that Kennedy would be forced to do so. So the group goes in there, they invade, there's no public uprising in support. The Cubans were ready for them. They captured or killed the entire invading force. It was a fiasco. In the midst of it, you had the heads of the CIA and top officials of the Pentagon with a midnight meeting with Kennedy saying, you've got to send in the American forces to bail them out. And Kennedy refused to do so. That's when Kennedy begins to develop his doubts about the wisdom of the military and the intelligence people. He refers to the CIA bastards, those Joint Chiefs, sons of bitches. He takes the power away from the CIA. He puts the CIA in every country under the ambassadors in those countries. He says, I'm going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it in the wind. And he says to his closest advisors, he says, if somebody comes in to talk to me about unemployment insurance, he said, I can challenge him, I can debate with him. He says, but the military and the intelligence people, you always assume they've got some kind of superior understanding, intelligence, and insight. He says, I've learned my lesson. Another occasion, he said, first thing I'm going to tell my successor is don't trust the military. He says, even on military matters, they don't necessarily know what they're talking about. So Kennedy learned a very important lesson at the Bay of Pigs. And he begins to doubt the military. But then in June, he's got a disastrous meeting with Khrushchev in Geneva. And then after that, things get very tense. And in July of 1961, we've got the crisis beginning, and the Berlin crisis. Kennedy makes a speech July 25th, which he announces an increase of defense spending of $3.45 billion. That sounds like chump change now compared to the level of defense spending we have. But at the time, that was considered an astronomical increase. So Kennedy calls for a 25% increase in the size of the Army. He wants to call up National Guards, call up American troops, reservists as well. He calls for a big fallout shelter building program in the United States. And then the Soviets respond with building the Berlin Wall. Kennedy actually says that, well, that's not, in some ways that's a relief because a wall is a lot better than a war, because it looked like the U.S. and the Soviet Union were about to go to war in the summer of 1961. But then we've got this increase in harsh rhetoric continuing through 1962, continuing through the very, very, very dangerous Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962.
All right, Peter, let's pick this up in the next part. And we'll talk about the nature of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as the main focus of our series is on what happens to domestic legislation, you can't look at domestic legislation without looking at the military expenditures, I said in the beginning. So these two questions go together and obviously continue to. All right, thanks, Peter, and thank you for joining us on the Real News Network, and join us for the next segment in our series with Peter Kuznick on Undoing the New Deal on the Real News Network.